For most of Hollywood history, Rob Reiner has represented something rare: stability. A man who transitioned seamlessly from beloved sitcom actor to one of the most influential directors of his generation. A filmmaker behind stories about friendship, love, loyalty, and moral courage. A public figure who appeared to have built not only a legendary career, but also a grounded family life far from the chaos that swallowed so many of his peers. That image lasted for decades. And for decades, it went largely unquestioned. Until now. Because when Rob Reiner's son finally spoke, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in quiet honesty, the story that emerged wasn't about scandal or betrayal. It was about something far more uncomfortable, something far more common, and, in many ways, far more painful. It was the story of growing up in the shadow of a man the world adored. The burden of a famous father. Children of Hollywood icons are often assumed to live privileged, effortless lives. Wealth, opportunity, access, doors that open before they're even touched. But privilege can coexist with absence. Rob Reiner's son did not describe a childhood filled with abuse or cruelty. There were no explosive accusations, no shocking revelations meant to dominate headlines. Instead, his confession centered on something subtler and more corrosive over time: emotional distance. He spoke about a home that looked complete from the outside, yet felt strangely hollow from within. A father who was physically present at times, but mentally elsewhere. A man whose attention was divided not out of neglect, but out of obligation to scripts, studios, deadlines, and the immense pressure of maintaining greatness. People think if your dad is successful, you feel safe, he said. But sometimes you just feel invisible. It wasn't said with bitterness. It was said with exhaustion, when success demands everything. Rob Reiner's rise wasn't accidental. His career required relentless focus. Each project carried enormous expectations, not just financial, but cultural. Films that shape generations don't come from half measures. And that is where the tragedy begins to take shape. The same discipline that made Reiner a master filmmaker may have made him emotionally unavailable at home. Not because he didn't care, but because he was constantly giving everything away elsewhere. Hollywood rewards presence on set, not presence at dinner tables. His son described moments that seemed small at the time: missed conversations, postponed promises, emotional check-ins that never quite happened. But small moments accumulate. Over years, they harden into patterns. Over decades, they shape identity. I learned early not to ask for too much, he admitted, because everyone already wanted something from him. The silence that followed. Perhaps the most revealing part of the confession was not what was said, but how long it took to say it. This wasn't a young man lashing out. This was an adult who had carried the weight quietly. For years, he internalized the belief that his feelings were insignificant compared to his father's achievements. That complaining would seem ungrateful. That voicing pain would feel like betrayal, not just of a parent, but of a public narrative millions believed in. So he stayed silent. And in that silence, something fractured. Children of famous parents often grow up managing two versions of reality: the private one they live in and the public one everyone else consumes. When those two realities don't align, confusion sets in. Then guilt. Then self-doubt. If everyone else loves your father, why don't you feel closer to him? No villains, only consequences. What makes this story especially painful is that it resists easy blame. Rob Reiner is not painted as a monster. His son does not describe him as malicious or intentionally cruel. Instead, the portrait that emerges is of a man who did what he believed was right, working hard, providing stability, building a legacy, without fully realizing what that legacy might cost those closest to him. And that's where the emotional weight hits hardest. Because this isn't just a Hollywood story. It's a human one. How many parents chase success believing it will benefit their children, only to realize too late that what their children needed most wasn't achievement, but attention, the moment of realization. The confession didn't come after a dramatic falling out. It came after reflection, after years of adulthood, distance and perspective. Rob Reiner's son spoke about reaching a point where he stopped waiting for his father to change and started confronting what that waiting had done to him. I realized I was still trying to earn something I should have received freely. That realization didn't bring closure. It brought grief. Grief for the relationship that never fully formed. Grief for conversations that would never happen in the way he once imagined. Grief for a version of his father that existed more clearly on movie screens than in memory. Why this confession matters. Hollywood is filled with dramatic revelations. This one stands apart because of its restraint. There is no rage here. Only truth spoken too late to undo the past, but not too late to name it. And that is why audiences find it so painful. Because it forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when love exists, but connection doesn't? And once that realization settled in, it didn't explode outward. It collapsed inward. That was the part few people understood when they first heard fragments of his confession. There was no confrontation scene, no dramatic reckoning where father and son finally said everything they had held back. Life didn't pause to allow that kind of clarity. Instead, time kept moving, quietly widening the emotional distance that had always been there. He described entering adulthood with a strange contradiction inside him. On one hand, he carried pride in his father's achievements. On the other, he carried a persistent sense of emotional starvation he couldn't quite name. He succeeded professionally, formed relationships, and outwardly appeared stable. Yet something always felt unfinished. I was good at functioning, he admitted, but I wasn't good at feeling. That numbness didn't come from trauma in the traditional sense. It came from adaptation, from learning early on that emotional needs were inconvenient, that the safest way to stay connected was to stay low maintenance, to not ask, to not interrupt, to not need. And those lessons followed him into every relationship that came after. The inheritance no one talks about. Fame doesn't just pass down opportunity. It passes down patterns. Without realizing it, he began to replicate the same emotional distance he had grown up with. Not because he wanted to, but because it was the only blueprint he had ever known. When relationships became emotionally demanding, he withdrew. When conflict required vulnerability, he defaulted to silence. He wasn't absent in the way his father had been, but he was guarded in the same way. That realization, he said, was devastating, because it meant the pain wasn't confined to the past. It was alive in the present. And that was the moment he stopped seeing his childhood as something that was over and started seeing it as something that was still shaping every decision he made. Seeing his father clearly for the first time. One of the most striking parts of his confession was the shift in perspective that came with age. As a child, his father was a figure to be reached. As an adult, his father became a man to be understood. He began to recognize the pressures his father had lived under. The relentless expectations. The weight of being responsible not just for creative success, but for hundreds of livelihoods on every project. The constant fear of failure in an industry that rarely forgives it. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it softened the edges. I don't think he knew how to be present, he said quietly. And I don't think anyone ever taught him. That sentence changed everything, because it reframed the story from one of neglect to one of inheritance. Emotional limitations passed down not through malice, but through modeling. A cycle that neither generation consciously chose, yet both lived inside. Why he finally spoke. The question everyone asked was simple. Why now? The answer wasn't publicity. It wasn't resentment. And it wasn't a desire to rewrite his father's legacy. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from carrying a story that didn't match the public narrative. Exhaustion from being congratulated on a childhood that never quite felt like his own. Exhaustion from protecting an image that came at the cost of his own truth. He spoke because silence had stopped being neutral. It had become damaging. There's a difference between privacy and erasure, he said, and I realized I had erased myself. This wasn't about exposing his father. It was about reclaiming his own voice. The cost of waiting too long. One of the most painful realizations he shared was that time had closed certain doors permanently. There are conversations you can only have when both people are still flexible enough to change. There are emotional repairs that require energy, humility, and time, resources that diminish as years pass. He didn't say reconciliation was impossible, but he acknowledged it would never look the way he once hoped. I stopped waiting for the apology I needed, he said, and started grieving the fact that I needed it at all. That grief didn't make him angry. It made him honest. A different kind of legacy. What lingers after his confession isn't shock. It's recognition. Because beneath the celebrity, beneath the fame, beneath the mythology of Hollywood families, this story mirrors something deeply universal. The quiet cost of emotional absence in homes that otherwise look successful. This wasn't a takedown. It was a warning. A reminder that children don't measure love by provision alone. They measure it by attention, by curiosity, by being seen when they speak and noticed when they don't. In telling his story, Rob Reiner's son didn't dismantle his father's legacy. He complicated it. And in doing so, he created a different kind of legacy for himself. One built not on silence, but on truth. In the next part, the story turns inward again. We explore how this confession reshaped his relationship with his own children and the deliberate choices he made to ensure that success would never again come at the cost of emotional presence. Because sometimes the most meaningful inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we refuse to pass on. A new approach to fatherhood. As Rob Reiner's son reflected on his own journey into fatherhood, it became clear that his experiences had reshaped his understanding of what it means to be a parent. For so long, he had felt like an outsider in his own family, a child of an iconic figure who could never quite measure up to the expectations set by his father's fame and success. But as he became a father himself, a profound shift took place. He didn't want to repeat the patterns of emotional distance that had characterized his relationship with his own father. He didn't want to be the kind of father who was physically present but emotionally unavailable. He understood now that being a good parent wasn't about providing a luxurious life or ensuring a legacy of professional success. It was about being present, emotionally available, and engaged. I had to unlearn a lot of things, he said, speaking candidly about his early years as a father. But I think I'm finally getting it. I don't want to make the same mistakes. He wanted to build a relationship with his children that was based on connection and understanding. He wasn't just their provider. He was their emotional anchor, someone they could turn to, someone who could hold space for their feelings. In many ways, he felt as though he was finally healing the wounds that had been caused by his own upbringing. Each small step he took toward being more emotionally present for his kids was a form of reclamation, a way of rewriting the script for future generations. The weight of the public eye. Yet, as he made these personal changes in his life, he was still haunted by the constant presence of the public eye. While Rob Reiner's son had spent most of his life living in the shadow of his father's fame, the weight of the public's gaze never fully left him, even as he sought to carve out his own identity. The media's obsession with Hollywood families, with the idea that children of famous figures are somehow doomed to repeat their parents' mistakes or destined to live up to a legacy that is both heavy and unrealistically perfect, was something he had never fully escaped. Every time he stepped into the public sphere, even briefly, he felt the pressure to measure up to an idealized image. You learn that people want stories that fit neatly into a narrative. But real life isn't like that, he admitted. I didn't want to be part of a story that was written by someone else. It was in these moments of reflection that he understood the true cost of fame, not just for the celebrity, but for those who have to live under its shadow. His father's success, while monumental, had created an environment in which every action and every word was scrutinized by the public. The constant performance was exhausting, and the emotional toll it took on his family was something few could fully understand. As Rob Reiner's son grew older, he recognized that his own story needed to be told on his own terms. The pain he had experienced in silence, the hurt from years of feeling unseen, could now be shared openly. It was his turn to step out from the shadows and speak his truth, not for the sake of scandal or drama, but for the sake of healing and understanding. The power of vulnerability. The most transformative aspect of Rob Reiner's son's journey, however, wasn't simply the fact that he acknowledged the emotional void left by his father's fame. It was his willingness to embrace vulnerability, to speak openly about his pain and his struggles. Vulnerability, something he had once viewed as a weakness, became his greatest strength. I used to think being vulnerable meant being weak, but I've learned it's actually where strength comes from, he said. When you let people in, when you show your scars, that's when real connection happens. It was this vulnerability that allowed him to break free from the chains of the past. He didn't need to hide behind a facade of perfection or success. He didn't need to be the perfect son of a perfect father. What he needed was to be authentic, to be human. This understanding didn't just help him heal. It helped him connect with others in a way he never had before. The moment he stopped hiding his true feelings, he began to see his relationships change. His friends, his partners, his children, they all saw him for who he really was. And that acceptance, that genuine connection, was what he had been searching for all along. A legacy rewritten. As the years passed, Rob Reiner's son began to come to terms with the reality of his relationship with his father. He understood now that while his father's legacy was complex, it didn't define him. He was not simply the son of a famous director. He was his own person, with his own story to tell. I've learned to embrace who I am, not just as his son, but as me, he reflected. And that's the most freeing thing I've ever done. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, the ability to rewrite his own legacy independent of the expectations placed upon him. He had learned from his father's mistakes, but he wasn't bound by them. He was carving out a new path, one where emotional presence, vulnerability, and connection were at the forefront. His relationship with his father, while complicated, had ultimately led him to a place of understanding. And in that understanding, he found a new kind of peace. Looking forward, as Rob Reiner's son now reflects on his journey, he knows that there is still much work to be done. The emotional wounds of the past will never completely disappear, and there will always be moments of doubt and struggle. But he is no longer afraid to confront them. He is no longer afraid to speak his truth. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal, but I've learned to live with it, he said, and I'm finally okay with that. The journey from silence to truth, from emotional distance to presence, has been long and painful, but it has also been one of self-discovery, redemption, and healing. And as he continues to walk this path, he knows that the legacy he creates now will be one that's rooted in love, vulnerability, and the courage to be truly seen. It's a legacy he's finally proud to call his own. The ripple effects of change. As Rob Reiner's son continued to navigate his journey, one thing became increasingly clear. His story was not his alone. His transformation, his decision to face the pain of the past and rebuild from it, had a profound impact on everyone around him. Not just on his children, but on his friends, colleagues, and even those who had watched his family from afar. In conversations with close friends, he began to realize how many people had silently endured similar struggles. The weight of emotional absence, the difficulty of connecting with a parent who was physically present but emotionally distant, was not unique to his family. It was a shared experience among many people, particularly those raised in the public eye. I thought for a long time that this was something just my family went through, he said, reflecting on the conversations he'd had over the past few years. But when I started opening up, I realized it's not just about fame. It's about a lack of emotional presence that so many people struggle with. That realization was both humbling and empowering. It allowed him to see that his healing process wasn't just for him, but for everyone who felt the same way. His vulnerability became a mirror for others, and in doing so, it began to encourage others to speak up about their own experiences of emotional neglect and the toll it had taken on their lives. Rebuilding relationships. One of the most significant outcomes of Rob Reiner's son's journey was the impact it had on his own relationships. Reconnecting with his father had been a long, slow process. But it had started, and the first steps toward mending the emotional gap between them had begun with understanding, not just of each other, but of themselves. Rob Reiner's son spoke candidly about how their relationship had changed over the years. In the beginning, there had been a deep sense of resentment, a frustration that his father hadn't been more present when he needed him the most. But as he grew older and found his own voice, he began to understand that his father's own emotional shortcomings were not necessarily rooted in malice, but in the pressures of his career and the cultural expectations placed on him. They didn't have the kind of father-son relationship that many people fantasized about, filled with heartfelt conversations and frequent bonding moments. But they did begin to make progress. It was slow, awkward at times, but it was real. "We still have a lot of ground to cover," he admitted. "But for the first time, I feel like I'm not just his son. I'm his equal, and that changes everything." With that understanding, Rob Reiner's son learned to let go of the perfection he once sought. The need for a picture-perfect relationship with his father faded into something more grounded, mutual respect, and a shared understanding that their bond didn't have to be flawless to be meaningful. The impact of breaking silence. As time passed, the decision to break his silence became a defining moment in his life. It wasn't just about confronting his past. It was about freeing himself from it. The act of publicly acknowledging the pain he had carried for so long allowed him to reclaim his own narrative. He was no longer defined solely by his father's legacy, nor by the wounds of his childhood. It also had a ripple effect beyond his personal life. In interviews, podcasts, and public talks, Rob Reiner's son began to share his experiences more openly, creating space for others to do the same. His vulnerability encouraged others to confront their own emotional pain, to share their own stories of familial distance, and to seek the healing they needed. "We all have stories like this, whether we come from famous families or not," he said in one of his interviews. "The more we talk about it, the less power these stories have over us. I want to help others see that they're not alone." His openness created a platform for important conversations about emotional well-being, family dynamics, and the cost of fame. It gave people permission to address their own personal struggles without fear of judgment or rejection. A new legacy. Ultimately, Rob Reiner's son's journey was about breaking free from the weight of inherited expectations and creating his own legacy. He had spent so many years living in the shadow of his father's success, trying to measure up to an ideal that didn't reflect his own truth. But as he began to face the emotional scars of his past and rewrite his narrative, he realized that his legacy didn't need to be bound by his father's accomplishments. It could be his own. And in doing so, he created something profoundly different. A legacy not of fame or achievement, but of honesty, vulnerability, and emotional healing. A legacy where presence mattered more than perfection. "I spent too many years living in the shadows of other people's expectations," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Now, I'm just trying to be the best version of myself. Not for anyone else, but for me." His relationship with his father, while never perfect, had evolved into something more meaningful. They had learned to see each other in a new light, to understand the flaws and struggles that made them human. And with that understanding came a sense of peace, not just for Rob Reiner's son, but for Rob Reiner himself. It wasn't about undoing the past. It was about learning from it. And with each passing day, he found that the more he embraced his own story, the more he could finally move forward, no longer weighed down by the past, but instead empowered by the lessons it had taught him. The future of healing. As Rob Reiner's son continues to move forward in his life, the future remains uncertain. But for the first time, he feels hopeful. He understands that healing is a journey, not a destination. And though there may always be scars, he's no longer afraid to face them. "Healing isn't about perfection," he said with a small smile. "It's about showing up for yourself, day after day, even when it's hard. That's what I'm doing now, and that's what I'll keep doing." His journey, though painful, has become one of empowerment. It's a journey that will continue to shape him and his relationships, and it's one that will undoubtedly inspire others who find themselves caught in the same web of emotional complexity. The legacy of Rob Reiner's son will not be defined by his famous last name. but by his courage to confront his past, his willingness to be vulnerable, and his commitment to building a future where emotional connection takes precedence over success. In the end, that might just be the most powerful legacy of all, embracing imperfection. As Rob Reiner's son moved further into his own life, a key lesson became clearer. Imperfection was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. His earlier attempts at hiding his struggles, the emotional baggage, the need for validation, the desire for approval from a father who was often absent, had been a way to avoid confronting painful truths. But now, those imperfections were the foundation of his strength. For so long, I thought I had to be perfect, he shared. But perfection was a mask. It was an attempt to make up for what I lacked. Now, I realize my flaws are what make me real, and that's what people can connect with. This realization didn't come overnight, nor was it easy to accept. But once he acknowledged it, everything began to change. No longer did he need to live up to a false narrative of what his life should have been. The expectations that had once driven him, driven by a fear of being less than his father's image, started to fade. The mask he had worn for so many years, trying to portray a perfect family, a perfect life, was slowly coming off. Behind that mask was a man who had spent years hiding from himself, suppressing emotions and truths in the hope of avoiding the pain of facing his past. But facing the truth, he discovered, was not as devastating as he had feared. It was liberating, giving himself permission to be human. In the months that followed, he began to give himself permission to be human, to feel, to make mistakes, to not have all the answers. He started to allow himself the freedom to be vulnerable, not just in front of others, but within himself. We all think we need to have it figured out, he said. But the truth is no one really does. We're all just doing the best we can. And that's enough. This shift in mindset was transformational. It allowed him to connect with people on a much deeper level, not as a public figure with a famous last name, but as someone who had walked through the same struggles, doubts, and fears as everyone else. His vulnerability, once a source of shame, became a bridge that brought him closer to the people in his life, from his family to his friends to strangers who reached out to him after hearing his story. More importantly, it gave him the ability to show up for himself in ways he never had before. A new relationship with his father. As his emotional healing continued, his relationship with his father also evolved. It was not a sudden transformation, nor was it perfect, but there was a noticeable shift. Rob Reiner, now older and more reflective, began to understand the emotional toll his career had taken on his family. As a father himself, he began to appreciate the cost of fame, the sacrifices it demanded, and the toll it took on his own ability to be present for his children. Their conversations were no longer about blame, but about understanding. His father, once distant and consumed by his own success, started to take more responsibility for the emotional distance that had marked their relationship. And his son, in turn, began to forgive, not just his father, but himself. "I don't think we'll ever be perfect," he said of his father, "but we're getting there, and that's all we can really do." There was no grand apology. There didn't need to be. The journey was one of gradual understanding, and it wasn't about erasing the past, but accepting it. Through small, quiet steps, they began to build a relationship founded on mutual respect and acceptance, rather than expectation and resentment. Legacy reimagined. As time passed, Rob Reiner's son began to see his legacy in a new light. The shadows of his father's fame no longer loomed over him. Instead, he understood that his legacy would not be defined by his family name, but by how he lived, how he treated others, how he showed up for his children, how he healed from the emotional wounds of the past, and how he broke free from the patterns that had held him captive for so long. "It's not about the name you carry," he said with a sense of resolve. "It's about how you live your life, the choices you make, the way you show up for the people you love." His story was no longer one of silence or resentment. It was one of empowerment and healing. It was a story that didn't just belong to him, but to everyone who had ever felt the weight of unspoken truths and emotional distance in their relationships. He understood now that the true legacy of any family, any individual, was not measured by their public success, but by the love they gave, the relationships they nurtured, and the honesty with which they approached their own lives. Moving forward, with every step he took toward healing, Rob Reiner's son became more certain of his path. The emotional baggage he had carried for so long was still there, but it no longer defined him. He no longer felt the need to run from it, to mask it, or to prove anything to anyone. Instead, he learned to live with it, and in doing so, he found a sense of freedom he never thought possible. You can't change the past, he reflected, but you can choose how you move forward. And that's where the real power is. As he continued to build his life, as a father, as a man, and as a person forging his own identity, he found that the most important thing was not to be defined by the expectations of others, but to define himself on his own terms. The weight of his father's legacy was no longer a burden. It was simply a part of his story. And in this new chapter, Rob Reiner's son wasn't just living in the shadow of fame. He was stepping into his own light, embracing his imperfections, and creating a legacy that would be uniquely his. One built not on public acclaim, but on the quiet strength of living authentically. In the end, that was the greatest legacy he could leave, and the most profound healing of all: reconciliation with the past. As Rob Reiner's son continued to build a life rooted in authenticity, he also found himself looking back, not with bitterness or regret, but with a sense of understanding. He had spent so many years running from the past, trying to avoid the pain it caused him, that he now realized it was the past that had shaped him into the person he had become. Without those struggles, he wouldn't have developed the resilience or self-awareness that now guided him. For years, he had carried the emotional weight of his relationship with his father as a burden. But as he worked through his healing, he began to see that the burden wasn't necessarily something that needed to be carried forever. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant integrating the pain into his narrative and moving forward from it, not as a victim, but as someone who had triumphed over it. "I'm not defined by what happened to me," he shared in a moment of reflection. "I'm defined by how I've learned to live with it." And that's where the power lies. The process wasn't easy, and there were still moments of sadness when he remembered the years of emotional neglect. But in these moments, he learned to approach the sadness with compassion for himself and his father. Rather than blaming or resenting, he embraced the notion that both of them had done the best they could with the circumstances they had been given. Redefining fatherhood. In many ways, his own journey through healing had informed his approach to fatherhood. Now, as he spent time with his children, he made a conscious effort to be more present, emotionally and mentally. He realized that the emotional presence he had lacked from his own father was the very thing he wanted to give his kids. He took time each day to connect with them, to listen to their stories, and to make sure they knew they were seen and valued. He wasn't just the provider. He was there for the emotional highs and lows of their lives as well. The small moments, the ones that might have once seemed insignificant, became the moments that mattered most. When I look at my kids, I see so much of myself in them. But I also see what they deserve, he said with a quiet certainty. They deserve to know they are loved. They deserve to be seen. Fatherhood became a journey of unlearning the patterns of the past and creating something new, something rooted in emotional intimacy, love, and openness. As his children grew, he began to realize that they weren't the only ones learning from him. He was learning from them, too. They taught him the value of unconditional love, the joy of small moments, and the importance of creating a safe space for vulnerability. Through his relationship with them, he found the courage to keep pushing forward, to keep breaking down the walls he had once built around his emotions. A future unwritten. Looking forward, Rob Reiner's son felt an overwhelming sense of peace that had once seemed out of reach. His life was no longer defined by the struggles of the past or by the need to meet expectations that weren't his own. He understood now that his future was his to create. It wasn't about repeating the mistakes of the past. It was about making new choices based on everything he had learned. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead. There would be more difficult conversations, more emotional moments, and more opportunities for growth. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face them with a heart full of compassion for himself and those around him. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But I can shape my future. And that's what I'm doing now." His path forward was no longer clouded by resentment, guilt, or fear. It was illuminated by the strength he had found through vulnerability, through honesty, and through embracing the imperfection of life. The gift of self-acceptance. As he continued his journey, Rob Reiner's son became increasingly aware of the profound gift that self-acceptance had given him. It wasn't just about forgiving his father, or even forgiving himself for the ways he had allowed the past to shape him. It was about embracing who he truly was, all of it, the flaws, the mistakes, and the lessons learned along the way. Self-acceptance, he realized, was the final step in healing. It was not about erasing the pain or pretending it never existed. It was about accepting the full spectrum of his experiences and understanding that they didn't have to define him, but they did inform who he had become. "The hardest part of this whole journey was accepting myself," he said. "But once I did, everything else started to fall into place." He no longer felt the need to hide or perform for others. He was simply content in who he had become, someone who had learned to live authentically and with intention. And in that authenticity, he found a peace he never thought possible. Legacy in the making. Looking back at his father's legacy, Rob Reiner's son knew that his own journey had altered the course of his family's history. The emotional distance that once plagued their relationship had given way to understanding, and while their story would never be perfect, it would be marked by growth and forgiveness. He no longer saw himself as a footnote in his father's tale, but as someone writing his own story, one where his voice was finally heard. His own legacy was now being shaped not by the fame of his family, but by his ability to love, to connect, and to heal. "I don't need to be famous. I just want to be a good man, a good father," he said, smiling softly. "That's the legacy I'm building, and that's enough." His journey had been long and difficult, but it had ultimately brought him to a place of peace. And for the first time, he understood that peace wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing life as it came, with all its imperfections, and choosing to move forward with love and acceptance. As he looked to the future, Rob Reiner's son felt hopeful. The road ahead was unwritten, but it was his to walk. And with each step, he knew he was creating the life he had always deserved, a life of authenticity, healing, and love. And that, he realized, was the true legacy he wanted to leave behind, reclaiming his own identity. As Rob Reiner's son moved forward with his newfound peace, he found himself reflecting more and more on the concept of identity. For much of his life, he had been trapped in the idea of who he was supposed to be. First, he was defined by his father's legacy, then by the expectations of the public. Over time, those external definitions wore him down. He had spent so many years trying to fit into molds that didn't align with his true self, believing that if he met the expectations set before him, he would finally find fulfillment. But in the quiet moments of reflection, he came to understand that identity wasn't something to be earned or given. It was something to be discovered. It wasn't something dictated by the world around him, but something that came from within. The more he embraced his authenticity and let go of external pressures, the more he found that he was allowed to exist as he truly was, without needing to be anything for anyone else. "For so long, I tried to be someone I thought I should be," he said with a sense of clarity. "But now, I'm just trying to be me, and that's enough." In embracing his true identity, he also understood that it wasn't about perfection. It was about growth. Every mistake, every failure, every moment of uncertainty was a part of his journey, and those were the moments that had taught him the most. Growth wasn't linear, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. He now saw those moments of struggle as necessary parts of his story, not obstacles to be avoided. Cultivating meaningful connections. Another significant aspect of Rob Reiner's son's healing was his renewed approach to relationships. Having spent much of his life feeling disconnected from his father and often holding back his emotions, he now saw relationships, whether with family, friends, or colleagues, through a new lens. Instead of fearing the vulnerability that came with emotional intimacy, he began to view it as a strength. He learned that true connection could only happen when he allowed others to see him for who he really was, flaws and all. No more hiding behind the persona he had built up to protect himself from rejection or criticism. Instead, he chose openness, letting others in and allowing them to witness his growth and struggles. I used to think being vulnerable meant being weak, but now I know it means being brave, he reflected. It's about letting people see the real you, and in doing that, you create the kind of connections that truly matter. This shift in mindset also allowed him to forgive, not just his father, but himself. There had been so much guilt and anger tied to their relationship, to the absence he had felt for years. But as he let go of the need for things to be perfect, he realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolution, it was about acceptance. Accepting that mistakes had been made, that both he and his father had fallen short, but that they were still human and they could still move forward, creating a new narrative for his children. As he embraced the lessons from his past and began to redefine his future, one of the most important things Rob Reiner's son focused on was creating a new narrative for his own children. He understood now that emotional presence was the foundation of any healthy relationship, and he was determined to give his kids what he had always longed for: emotional connection, unwavering support, and the freedom to be themselves without fear of judgment. I want my kids to know that no matter what happens, they're always loved, he said, a smile creeping onto his face. I want them to feel safe enough to be who they truly are, without having to hide their feelings. And I want them to know that they're not alone in their struggles. He made a promise to himself and to them that he would be the kind of father who was always there, not just physically, but emotionally. He would show up for them in ways that perhaps he hadn't always experienced himself. Through his own journey, he had learned that the greatest gift he could give them wasn't material wealth or the pressure to succeed, but the assurance that they were always seen, heard, and valued, just as they were. A legacy of authenticity. With his emotional journey coming full circle, Rob Reiner's son found himself at peace with his past and full of purpose for his future. He had spent so many years trying to live up to the legacy of his father, but now he understood that his true legacy would not be defined by the Hollywood name he carried, but by the way he chose to live his life. It's not about what my father achieved, or what I might achieve, he said, finally free from the expectations that once consumed him. It's about how I lived, how I loved, and how I showed up for the people who mattered most. He realized now that authenticity was the most important thing he could offer the world. In a society that often values perfection, success, and image, he had come to understand that the real strength lay in embracing vulnerability and letting go of the need to be anything other than yourself. The legacy he was building now, for himself and for his family, was one founded on love, emotional presence, and the courage to live authentically. Looking ahead, the future was still unwritten, but Rob Reiner's son was no longer afraid. He understood that life would continue to be unpredictable, full of both joy and sorrow, but he also knew that he could face whatever came his way with the strength that came from self-acceptance and authenticity. The path ahead was clear now. It was a path that didn't require him to follow in anyone's footsteps, but instead to forge his own. He had learned that his legacy wasn't something to be passed down from one generation to the next. It was something he had to create for himself every single day. And he was determined to make it one that he could be proud of, not because of any external measure of success, but because it was built on truth, love, and the courage to be real. I'm still learning, still growing, he said with quiet confidence. But I'm living my life the way I want to, and that's enough for me. The next chapter of his life would be one where he was no longer defined by the mistakes of the past, but by his ability to heal, to love, and to live authentically. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.